everyone. Welcome back to Collaborative Edges, conversations to inspire initiatives across languages and cultures. I'm Quispe-Agnoli, the host of this podcast series. For this edition, we have in the studio two scholars who work in the intersections of Indigenous studies and photography by and about others. Mary Vogel, Colorado State University, and Candice Keller, Michigan State University, and myself, by the way, this time. Okay, hello and welcome, Mary and Candice.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you, Rocio. Nice to be here.
Oh, thank you for being here as well. And Mary, Candice, and I, along with other colleagues, are sharing our work on Indigenous photographers of Mali, Morocco, and Peru as part of our collaborative initiative, Picturing Others from Both Sides of the Lens, an interdisciplinary seminar on Indigenous photography, self-portraits, preservation, and epistemic disobedience that is being held at Michigan State University in April 2018. So let's start with a general question to the two of you. Why studying photography, and why studying Indigenous or Native photographers of Africa and South America? Mary.
I'm working on a larger project about art criticism in North Africa, so I'm looking at it kind of from a literary and cultural perspective, but I want to say that Moroccan art, I find it so special and unique, amazing aesthetically and visually, and not everyone is exposed to that. And so part of what makes me excited about this is to be able to connect the cultural studies and literary studies with this just fabulous production.
Okay. Candice?
I, too, came at this research from African studies, not from photography. So though I'm an art historian, a lot of people who study this subject come from the side of photography, but I came from studying Malian culture and language and art. And so I'm really interested in the connections between the rural and the urban, the contemporary and the traditional, and the local and the global through photography, and the ways in which local ideas, social theories, related aesthetic concepts can help us read the images, understand what was going on with these particular photographic practices, and the relationships between the photographers and their subjects, and the role of photography in society, and learn more about the local historical significance of the images, so that when it's interjected into the larger canon, we have a lot to learn from an African context, and that way can speak to other images that we're used to seeing, like in National Geographic or on the news, which is not the same kind of imagery, and so it can speak to those kinds of stereotypes.
Yes, and I agree. I'm starting to work Andean photography and photography by indigenous photographers of Peru and Bolivia, and to a certain extension Ecuador. And I agree with both of you. First, as Mary says, it's quite unknown. You know, there are many photographs about the Indian peoples of Peru, but what is unknown is when the photographer behind the lens is of indigenous descent or mestizo. Mm-hmm. And so it's unknown. And I was talking earlier with Jorge Coronado, who's also working on this in this area, and we're both literary scholars. That's our background, and we were saying how unknown it is, and we have to make it to call attention, to put the focus on that kind of work that is very unknown. And the other issue is, as Candice says, is it's local. It's local, but it also has an impact on at the national level, and especially also at the global level, because our people working on the Andes were constantly confronted with very stereotypical views of what constitutes an Indian of that region. Yeah. You know, and that is what we are trying to to deconstruct and understand and see what is going on. So what is interesting for me is that a photographer from Morocco and from Mali and from Peru, they confront similar dilemmas and similar issues and problems, and how they face them or how they try to solve them or address them. So going now into these a little bit more specific, is there anything different or unique about the photographers you study and how they depict others, others, or the ones they are photographing, the subjects or the objects of their activity? Is there anything specific you have noticed so far, Candice?
Are you asking what is the difference between the indigenous photographers that I work with, or Malian photographers, versus how Westerners might picture? Okay.
Yes, that's
so
point. Yeah.
A primary difference would be showing these individuals as cosmopolitan and global and engaged with the wider context, which is an interest, particularly in portraiture, for the subjects that are depicted, but also the photographers who depict them. And so instead of using landscape backdrop paintings, which that did happen sometimes, but for the most part, a lot of them used pattern, highly ornate or graphic pattern textiles for the backdrop, which tends to flatten the picture plane, put more focus on the face, the eyes of the individual, empower them in a way. They're much more. It's not a passive view. They're sort of active, chic even. And oftentimes they'll take a low vantage point in the studio, so you're actually looking up at them in the way that Hollywood would do. So I think highlighting their desirability, that they are, you want to be like, their enviable status, if you will, whether it was lived or whether it was aspired to. So through props or through their own attire or whatever they brought into the studio, the photographers would use tricks to aggrandize them, so that to the viewing public, which is mostly their family and their friends, they have kind of an enviable, chic, fashionable status, and that has resonated, I think, in Western and global audiences as like fashion style photography, and it's been influential for fashion designers, and it's been influential for musicians and videographers. And so I think that kind of the pattern on pattern on pattern, the polka dotted flooring and the checkered backdrop, and then I think that style has been unique, but then also the sense of trying to aggrandize these cosmopolitan, primarily youths, has resonated, I think, with global publics, which is very different than the way that Westerners picture Malians or Africans.
Yes. And Mary, have you, or can you share something distinctive or unique that you have observed in photographers of Morocco?
Sure, yeah. In fact, one of the I cast my net kind of wide. I'm looking at 5 photographers, and that's probably too much for my project. But one is kind of speaking back to some of the stereotypes about veiled women and that they don't have agency and they're just victims. And part of what he does is appropriate this West African studio photography aesthetic. And so with the crazy patterns and the bright colors, and so he will go to Marrakesh, meet up with his friends there. He's based in London, but he goes to Marrakesh, gets his friends to pose. They'll put on some veils, and maybe the veil will have Louis Vuitton symbols on it, or a Coca-Cola, or pop kind of iconography, just to have a playful kind of spin on that. And I think it really kind of makes people think twice. A lot of his audience might be Europeans, and their idea about what the veil is and symbolizes and all that is a way to kind of turn that on its head.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it's what I notice in the photographers that I am starting to work with is how they, from one end, well, let's rephrase this. The photographers I'm looking into, they are from the first or the early decades of the 20th century. So the social and historical context, of course, sets up certain conditions, right? Mm-hmm. But from one end, they are responding to the market, and to the consumer. So they want to give to the consumer what they want. And this is where the exotism comes, mm-hmm. and the marketing and the postal cards, etc. No? But from the other end, this is the interesting part, and it's very, very subtle, as we were discussing today also with the work of Jorge Coronado, is that there is a critique there that is very subtle. You just have to be careful how you look at it. And earlier we were discussing the negotiation. I'm fascinated by the fact that those who were photographed, and I'm talking about indigenous people or mestizo people. Others talk about those who are subaltern. If they were paying for it, they had the power to negotiate. This is the way I want to be photographed, mm-hmm. and this is the way I want to be represented. Whether they were responding to models of Western models, mm-hmm. of presenting themselves is something else. Mm-hmm. But what I'm interested in is that they were negotiating, and we tend to assume, as I mentioned before, or I tend to assume, perhaps it's my assumption only, that the photograph has almost no saying. That the photograph, that the person who's being photographed has almost no saying, and it's the photographer who is in control of the situation. And I'm learning with you and with our other colleagues that there is more there to look at and to explore. And this brings me to the topic of representation and self-representation and identification, how I want to be identified and presented in a photograph, either if I'm the photographer or someone else. And could you share with us any findings you may have so far about the indigenous behind the lens who is photographing him or herself or her others, and how does this impact the field of photography that you are working with? Candice?
Well, I think I just sort of spoke to that in terms of how serving the local needs by using the highly ornate patterned backdrops that put the emphasis on the face, which is what people wanted in their portraits, by showing them as cosmopolitan, by showing them as connected with the globe, as chic. All of those things allowed, or these were negotiations, and people would let the photographer know what they wanted, or else they didn't even need to tell the photographer. There are some things that are just understood. Mm-hmm. The photographer had visual means to underscore or highlight whatever values it was they were representing, whether they wanted to commemorate a friendship, a particular relationship, a holiday, their firstborn child. There were ways that could be visually reinforced, as well as other concepts. But those practices in a global context, as I said, I think change the way people in the West are able to understand Africa and Africans in my case, because it's not National Geographic. It's not the disaster photos they see in the news. My students who see these photos from the 1960s, which seem very contemporary to them, and, there's photographs of depending on the clothing tied to Michael Jackson right at the same time as Michael Jackson was popular here. And they're like, why don't we see this kind of imagery? Why aren't we looking at all of the similarities, all of the connections, all of the innovations and cultural ideas, aesthetics from African contexts? Why isn't that popularized? Why isn't that what we see? And so I think when these images are more popularized, then it does help to change the conversation, and it has been inspirational to many designers, clothing designers, videographers. Janet Jackson has referenced, it's been in fashion magazines. Malik Sidibe was commissioned by the New York Times fashion magazine to do a shoot with Andreas Coquino. So it's part of a larger global, local conversation.
Okay. And Mary, could you share something with us about that? In the case of the photographers you're working with?
Sure. Yeah, the photographers I'm studying, they are also all very cosmopolitan and participate in this global art market. One of the challenges for them is if their project is to deconstruct these stereotypes of the Orient and Muslims and Muslim women and the veil and harems and all these things, part of their project is reconstructing those images with some kind of spin, with their own take that somehow tries to reinforce that sense of the agency of the people who are being depicted, or some kind of an ironic twist to it. Sometimes the challenge, and when they speak about it, they can be articulate, and people who are sort of running in the world of the contemporary, cosmopolitan art market may understand what they're trying to do. Other people seeing their exhibits, maybe they don't read the program notes. It runs that risk, I think, at times of reinforcing some of those stereotypes. Like,
I think it's unavoidable. Right?
Yeah.
As much as we would like that not to happen, but
and that challenge of that postmodern critique, is it to what extent is it always successful? And if it's not, is that the fault of the artist? Is that the spectators who aren't taking the time to really understand that, or their level of sophistication? There's a lot of questions around that.
I remember today we were discussing, and you posed this question to Jorge about that photograph by Martin Chambi called Tristeza Andina, Andean Sadness, and you said, you asked, why is that Indianismo, why is not Indigenismo? And then I was looking at that photograph because being a Peruvian, I see it and I said right away, oh, that is Indianismo, because that is our idea, my idea of the ideal frozen in time, ahistorical Indian, that we have this stereotype of the Andean Indian as a very sad person, and that is probably reinforced by the music, the pan flute music, and then all these associations come together when I look at that photograph. Me as a Peruvian, this is so. And Jorge was having the same or a similar reading, and but then I started looking at it while we were discussing today and following up or thinking in your question, and I said, yeah, I see certain things that the indigenista scholars who would have liked very much, which is the very dark skin, for instance, of the Indian and the phenotype. And that would be, for them, I am physically speaking, to the close to what this obsessive search for the authentic Indian.
That's like a valorization of that.
Yes, but it's still the whole setting, it's so like romantic, idealized, frozen in time, like floating, that is what makes it prone to be praised by Indianistas, and that is the part the Indigenistas, at least in Peru, didn't like, because the Indigenistas would focus on the negative part of Indian life, So, and the point is that these photographs, or these texts, as we were discussing earlier today, they are ambivalent. They are not easy to deconstruct. There has been usually only one way to read them. There are other ways to read them, and that is what we are asking ourselves today, and that's what makes it interesting, because and I do think we were also talking about this today, that different generations of scholars, they project what they expect to see, right? In the way they we see the artifacts, or they see the artifacts, that... and I'm thinking more in the difference between Indianista and Indigenista scholars that were very different in the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century in the case of Peru. So we were also talking about, in the case of Peru, and it's probably similar in the case of Morocco and Mali, that this is an understudied area. And we were, there is also the barrier of language, in the sense, as you were saying today at the end of your presentation, Candice, that you publish in English, but are you going to be read in Mali? No, and it's similar with us in the case of Peru, that if I publish in English, it will be known here, but not in Peru. But if I publish in Spanish, it will be read in Peru, but not so much here. So, and I don't know if you confront a similar situation in the case, Mary, in the case of...
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Because I guess if you publish in English, it won't be read in Morocco.
Well, and even in Morocco, I could publish in French, and it would only reach these specific elites, who are running in the same circles. And
it's the same thing in Mali.
Yeah, it's a fallacy of the language, because at least probably Mary, since she's a literary scholar like me, we have to publish. We're expected to publish in the two languages, in English, the scholarship, and in Spanish. Because if we only publish in English, we're not read in the Spanish-speaking academias, and vice versa. But we are making a career here, so we need to reach the public here. But so taking into account these difficulties of the profession, what would you advise to someone, a student or a young scholar, or, well, not even a young scholar, or someone who is starting to work in a field that is understudied? There is so much to do. There is so much rescue with the archive, also working with the archive. We were talking about that. What would you advise them to do, or if they want to embark in the study of indigenous or native photography? Candice?
I always say you have to learn a local language and spend a lot of time in the local place. So it requires getting grants that can support you to stay in a period for an extended amount of time, at least a year. I think it's really hard to do ethical work unless you do spend time, if you're focusing on indigenous, local, in my case, African subject matter. But there's a lot of graduate students right now who are actually focusing on photography in West Africa. It's become fairly popular, so hopefully over time we'll be able to reconstruct the larger history. Most of us have started to study it in a national context. Like I study photography in Mali, others study photography in Senegal or in Nigeria, but naturally these were porous borders and people were crossing them, and so now I would say collaborate, work together to kind of reconstruct these histories so that they're not just artificial. We've got enough work done now that we can start to work together, and that's what we're trying to do with this archive of Malian photography. Hopefully it'll become the archive of West African photography.
Yeah. It's a great contribution. It's a great achievement, but it's a great contribution towards preservation. Your project of the Archive of Malian Photography.
Thank you.
Yes. And Mary, what would you advise someone who is going into these waters? Yeah.
Well, one thing that I'm appreciating and learning from this seminar is that you can approach these works from a variety of disciplines. So there's the art history aspect, there's the ethnography aspect, there's the cultural studies aspect. So that's fun, and I think students from different areas or scholars, interested people. I think it's always have humility because. If you really want to become an expert, the road is long, and there are a lot of levels of expertise that you can dig down into. And then I think in a lot of places in, Africa, South America, when we're talking about learning working languages, you may need some working knowledge of several languages. And so, to get through those some layers of bureaucracy, you might, in West Africa or North Africa, French, standard Arabic, Moroccan Arabic, in Morocco, Amazigh languages, So depending on what you want to do and what type of art you want to study and what level you want to study at, there are a lot of options and choices. But definitely, I think your advice about seeking grants and funding and really digging deeper if you're a scholar, that's what you need to do and not stay on the surface.
Yes, one of the things I think one of the students who were today in the seminar mentioned, she was saying, Claudia, she was saying, talking to the people before she would ask them if she could take their photograph. She's not a photographer, she's a graduate student of literary studies, but she was talking about that. And I was remembering or thinking that I do the same. I do the same when I go to Peru, and I'm not a professional photographer. I just like to take photographs, and I'm specifically interested in weavers, and it's usually the women who weave today. In the past, it was men and women. Right now, currently, it's women. But I have so much respect, and I don't want them to think that I am looking at them as exotic artifacts for touristic consumption. That I like to engage in conversation with them. And I use some Quechua words intentionally. I don't speak Quechua, but I know a few words. I have some vocabulary and like to get closer to them, not to be that strange to them, because I'm already strange. They look at me and they say to me, "Señorita, you are from Lima, right?" Yeah, and they immediately they know I'm from the coast. I'm not from the highlands, also because of the way I speak, the way I dress. But that's what I do. I try to engage into a casual conversation, and I ask them what they are doing, and I ask them to teach me about the textile they are weaving. And then I ask them after some time, may I take a picture of you? Because I'm very interested in the act of weaving. And they always say yes, and they sometimes nervously smile or laugh. But it's a lot of respect. For me, it has to be a very respectful practice.
Yes. I agree. And I don't know if this is true where both of you work, but in Mali also you need a permit to take photographs. You need to go through the Ministry of Culture.
Oh, really? From people?
If you're researching.
Yeah. No, that doesn't happen in Peru. That doesn't happen in Peru, and it should happen, because the indigenous people, especially in the highlands, they are subject to being photographed by tourists all the time. And now we were talking about this earlier, that they have in the past, when I was a kid with my traveling with my parents, they would be shy. Either they would smile, they would freeze a smile, or they would just turn away, look the other way, because they didn't want to be photographed. But today, they have learned with the global market, give me $1 or $2 or dollars. They don't ask for the currency of Peru, and I'll let you photograph me, And I don't want to do that. And that's why I engage in conversation, and I try to get somehow close to them. Yeah,
I think so. I think building relationships and being respectful and developing trust is the only way really to do ethical field work, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. As I have said in other conversations, this is a fun conversation, part of a fun seminar. I'm having a lot of fun myself. So I would like to conclude this conversation. Thank you, the two of you, and invite everyone to visit our podcast page for more information on this seminar and the work of our guests and participants in this seminar. And finally, I would like to state the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Letters, any of our sponsors, or official entities of the university. I also want to thank technical producer Daniel Trego and invite you to tune in for our next podcast.